I love it when it does that. It's always like a ping, you're on. Uh, well, hello everyone. Just good to have you back for our third episode of Courageous Conversations. It's been quite interesting, Ken. I don't know, in the last 2 weeks, or two episodes more likely. I don't know about you, but it's been quite interesting hearing the people's responses and what's come back and forth from just engagement. What's your kind of perception? What have you taken away from the last 2 weeks or two episodes?
Yeah, people are finding it interesting. I think obviously the two were very, very different.
Mm-hmm.
And last time, fascinating, particularly for me, Justin, having two individuals from South Africa, and so lovely to hear their personal experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I did have one question, and that was about your water bottle.
I've
So
upgraded
we
it.
we need to get the clinking, because that's the kind of signature tune. It could be a kind of yeah, that's it. We need to hear you drink.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, I can gulp. How's that? I'll just drink really loudly. Yeah, this is a. I got this as a present. This whiskey so I'm drinking it tonight because it's just a lovely
Because it
malt.
numbs the pain.
Oh, it doesn't numb the pain. It makes me sound more intelligent than I really am.
Well, I'm.
It makes me a better dancer too. Uh, good. Yeah. Yeah. I think that it's been quite interesting just to hear that people are curious, uh, and there's an engagement. This is a new platform for me. It's a new platform for you, and just to see how people are engaging. Uh, yeah.
Well, I
So.
like the thought that that there will be something there that is just opening up,
Mhm.
and as we've said before, and I've been guilty of this all my ministry, we're much better at talking than we are at listening, in the sense of interactive communication. And of course, if you're in a large congregation, or well, a congregation, Sunday by Sunday, interaction and feedback is not easy, just acoustically, just
Yeah.
physically,
Yeah.
but also culturally. People are used to just sitting fairly passively, and either agreeing or disagreeing. But as a minister, as a preacher, you don't really know what people are thinking.
Yeah.
They'll say the polite thing usually, or they'll say nothing. Occasionally, quite well. Sometimes they're very affirming, and sometimes it's that helps. That really keeps you going.
Yeah.
But deep down, you don't know what they're thinking.
Yeah. I also, if you look at the way that education has probably changed in the last 50 years, when I started education or being educated in school, it was rows. You had the teacher in front,
Yeah, yeah.
and you had the row system. And towards the latter part of my education, which is not long ago, but some time ago, there was this. It started to be groups and group work. Now you go into a classroom and kids sit around and they're engaging and they're talking to each other.
Oh yeah.
Uh, but our churches are still set up often in this kind of like rigid line system that has the teacher in the front and everyone else, the students, in their lines.
And I guess that physical configuration in the classes was also an expression of the kind of approach to what you are being taught. In other words, it was kind of regimented. It was basically one way. And I'm thinking my day started in primary school every day with saying the Lord's Prayer. So you just stood up, you rattled through it, you murdered it in terms of its meaning and interpretation. It was all just phonetic, really.
Yeah.
And nobody taught us what it meant. But and that was the kind of approach to religion and faith. It was just by rote, you rattled
Yeah.
through it. There wasn't a questioning. There wasn't really any kind of depth of thought penetrating. It was really just, this is it, accept it, write it down, learn it, away you go.
Yeah. 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 And I mean, for me, it's just the question has become so central to where I am. I cannot have faith. For me, I cannot go into the Christian journey or any journey without a sense of doubt, because for me, doubt leads to this kind of wonder and this exploration. Like I haven't got it figured out, uh, and if I haven't got it figured out, then I haven't got God sussed out either. Which is it's exciting for me because there's still more to learn. There's more to engage with, and so doubt is pivotal to where I find myself.
And yet, I guess doubt is often a kind of loaded word, isn't it? There's a kind of almost a pejorative in it, that it's something bad, something corrosive, something to avoid, a sign of weakness. When clearly the opposite is the case. That that questioning and rejecting things that don't work and looking for things that do is part of life, and it should be part of faith.
Yeah.
And I wonder if we need to either just kind of redefine or reinvent doubt as a positive word, or we find a different word entirely, and look at we're engaged in searching. I like the word search.
Yeah, and for me that it's not about arriving. For me, if I ever get to a place of arriving, I think I'll be bored at it. But for me, it's this kind of exploration that there's still more to see. There's still more I don't know. There's still a whole vastness, and that keeps things fresh and new. And it also allows me to hold my perspective a bit lightly, because I'm not tied to it. Because I'm happy to let it go for something else that I discover.
Yes, but the question that you and I probably are both vulnerable to, and which we have to address, is what are the non-negotiables? If are there certain things that if we peel back all kinds of areas of faith and belief, we might say, well, yeah, we can see that or leave it, or we can reinterpret it. But what are the things that would be right down to the bone? This is the absolute rock, and nothing else will shift. I've never actually articulated that, so I'm not sure I know the answer until I have to. But it's a valid question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't have the answer to that question because, I don't think that departure point is an important place for me. Departing from solid foundation is, it doesn't bring life to me.
I suppose my kind of backstop or my foundation might well be, and this is hypothetical or at least provisional. I think I would certainly say would be focused around the best I can know of Jesus and his life and teaching. What was he trying to show the world? What was he trying to tell his society at the time? Bearing in mind that it was culturally appropriate, and it might not be culturally appropriate so much now. There may be things we would have to transform or reinterpret. But a whole lot of theology and doctrine has been built on top of that, which I quite often find difficult to subscribe to.
Yeah. And which is interesting because one of the questions this week, which is a great segue into the question, is there's that verse in John 14, in my Father's house there's many rooms, speaking it specifically in our first episode about the afterlife, and our deconstructing the afterlife and saying, well, maybe we're a bit atheist about or uncertain about the afterlife as it's traditionally understood,
or agnostic, certainly.
Yeah, agnostic. That's a better word.
Okay.
But in the middle of or a bit late in that verse, Jesus goes, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes through to the Father but through me." And how you deal with that, because that verse, for some people, has been Jesus's foundation. The foundation is that there's one way, and that's it. Or they interpret that verse to mean one specific. If you don't believe this foundational aspect, well, there's no place for you in heaven or in God's love, in God's embrace.
Mm-hmm. I can remember as a teenage Christian coming through a kind of quite a strong evangelical group, to whom I am very grateful, but moved a long way from their set of beliefs now. But they were very important in my life, and I appreciate that. But I had an elderly relative. We called her a cousin, but she was some kind of distant cousin who'd been a missionary in Morocco. Now, at the time, she was in her 70s. I mean, this must have been pre-war. It must have been between the two wars, and she'd had a really hard time. Because we had stories of anybody that converted and became a Christian being disowned by their family and death threats. And I mean, it was, and that I know does still go on in many parts. But I can remember as a youngster looking at this verse and thinking, now, what does this mean for other faiths? Does that mean that everybody else is wrong? And that, what does God think about people from, we called them Mohammedans in those days, which is a terrible term. But, what does that say about Muslims? I got a big long explanation, which as a boy went right over my head. Actually, didn't convince me one bit. But even then, to me, it sounded extremely exclusive. And I think you're right. It can be taken, has been taken that way.
Yeah, the way I'm starting to see that verse, the way, the truth, and the light, is to go a little bit further or earlier, where Jesus says, "In my house there's many rooms." And I think he's talking about the temple, and the temple of the temple is where heaven and earth meet. And I think what he's saying is that in my understanding of life, or my way, it's an inclusive thing. There's place for everyone, whether you're Jew, you're Gentile, male, female, whatever your sexual orientation, whatever that is. In my house there are many rooms, and then Thomas gets a bit confused and he says, show us, how will we know the way that you're going? Basically, he says, and Jesus says, well, just watch. If you see me, yeah. And I just think that for me, this whole section is about Jesus opening the doors rather than closing them. Jesus embracing it, and for me, the way, how I understand the way, is about the principles that Jesus lives for, the things that bring life in this world. It's not about a belief system. Anyone can believe. We can all say the creeds, but when we really get down to the nuts and bolts of it, do we live the way that Jesus told us to live? And that's how I understand the way to be inclusive.
I think there's a whole kind of imagery here. There's one great big kind of running metaphor, and we can, I think, misunderstand the metaphors. I don't think of. He talks about going to prepare a place, and I'll come back and so that you can be where I am, kind of thing. Now, we tend as ministers to read that in the context of a funeral. So clearly, that kind of predisposes you to think it's talking about an afterlife and death and some kind of soul or pilgrimage or whatever. I don't think necessarily meant that at all. It's appropriate for that, but I don't think it's principally about that. And he's going to prepare a place. What's he going to do? Is he going to open the windows and put the air freshener and put new linen on the beds? What does he mean? Go to prepare a place?
Yeah.
That's just a picture. It's just an image. And the Father's house. Yeah, I know. I think that referred to the temple quite often, but there are other and wider applications of just. Well, the other Gospels talk about the kingdom of God, and being in God's under God's rule and authority and presence. I just think it's an image of talking about being with and close to God, whatever. And that physical image of a house just is a handy one that means something to people of the day.
Yeah, it also. Bridegrooms or the groomsmen would go and prepare a place for his bride. And if you think about it as a story of love, that God has got preparing a place for you. That God has not forgotten you. God is busy. You're always welcome in the house of God. So I think, as I said, for me, it opens up Jesus. It opens up this message. It's not about chopping it even finer.
But that passage is, there's quite a lot of John's Gospel after that passage.
Yeah.
So although John's chronology is all different from the other three, it's quite clearly that he seems to be preparing his disciples for what he's about to go through in the way that John tells the story. Now the latest Gospel, it's a long time. It's possibly 60 years after the events. There's been quite a lot of development and theological reflection between the synoptics and John, as I understand it. And therefore this is a product of that community, and their reflections on the events, isn't it? So if he's going to prepare a place, maybe that's a way of alluding to his suffering on the cross, and that he's going to have to go through. He's planning to go through this period of being humbled and of suffering, and the story that we now are familiar with in terms of Good Friday and the crucifixion and the resurrection, and so maybe that's an allusion to that kind of thing, that they're going to have to go through that too. This is the way. This is my way to show you God.
Yeah, which is interesting because we also don't think of suffering, which is what the disciples, if they're going to follow that way, are going to go through. Yeah. We don't often associate suffering in terms of Christianity, or we think of suffering in our modern world as a being rights taken away from us, rather than suffering for what is right. In terms of I think Jesus was political in the sense he fought the case of the poor. And I think often we forget that, and we'll suffer for that if we do fight that way, or we go down that way. So maybe Jesus is preparing them for suffering in some ways.
Well, the disciples were clearly upset, and he's talking about not being afraid. There's some kind of reassurance, or seeking to give reassurance, and that's always going to be appropriate.
Yeah. And I think for us today, I think that maybe that invitation still invites us, or I think Jesus still invites us into that space as well.
But then, you could, going back to my teenage argument with my elderly cousin, in my house there are many rooms, or mansions as we used to hear it. Does that mean within God's love, if you have some kind of crossing over theology, you're either in with God or you're outcast from God, if there's that kind of separation in your theology that we're all heading towards, then is he saying then that those who may not be of different faiths would still be included? I mean, how big is this house? How many rooms does it have? Or is he saying, well, you have to follow me, but there's room for lots of people to follow me. Yeah. But all you people who follow me can only be those who follow me. It's not open to, all and sundry. I'm not making myself very clear, but
no. It's the question of, is Jesus exclusive? In the sense of if you're a Buddhist or something like that, are you invited as well?
I mean, again, as a boy, we all had these questions. If you're born in the middle of India and brought up a Hindu or indeed a Muslim, or in a Muslim country, then what chance have you got of hearing something about Jesus? Well, the answer might well be almost zero. Yeah. And the fact that I'm a Christian is because I'm in a Christian society. Yeah. So it wouldn't seem right that there is a God who is so partial that he will really favour only those who got a cultural head start against those who hadn't got a hope of hearing. If that's the one criteria by which we are acceptable or gain admission to this mythical house, then I don't think that makes sense. That's not logical. It's not loving.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, speaking last week or 2 weeks when we spoke about racism, I wonder where this theology comes from. Because if it's a modern construct, if it's modern, it might have gone with this in Western worlds where it was almost like a white privilege. If you believe in Christianity, you take on Western values, and then you're in. And so being Christian was also, or following Jesus was basically being white, or being white and European. And so I just don't know where this theology comes from. So it would need more digging.
Oh, you've got my mind spinning in a different direction now. I mean, I remember looking at a pamphlet in the church at one point, and I'm not being critical. It was a Christian Aid pamphlet, and it was a kind of diary through the year, I think it was a prayer type diary. And they featured individuals, and there was mainly African, I have to say, African and some Asian. All the individuals that they featured had either biblical or European names. And I thought, actually, I felt quite sad. I thought they probably have some kind of, surely they have still got a tribal name, something which is African or indeed Asian or Indian, whatever. But somehow or other, we've given them a name that makes them seem more acceptable to us. There's a cultural colonialism there.
Yeah, or a name we can pronounce.
Yes.
Like we're not embarrassed to say it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, I just wondered. I just thought that was kind of symbolically. I was slightly unhappy with that.
Yeah. I think, if we're going down to the nuts and bolts of things, I think we've gotten belief in Jesus confused with action. Like belief for me can be a head thing, but it can also be a hand and heart thing. If we're going to take Jesus's way seriously, we love our neighbors, we love ourselves, we care for the poor and the marginalized. We're willing to die for even our enemy. That belief that moves into our hearts and hands and our mouth and that's embodied in flesh and blood. That's a totally different belief to having a theoretical knowledge. And I think often the interpretation is, well, if you believe in Jesus, then you're fine. But it's been a head thing and not a heart and hands and mouth thing. And I know some Buddhists who get the heart and hands and engage with the poor. I know some Muslims that are doing the same thing, and I know some Christians that are nowhere near it. That they pronounce Jesus with their lips, with their head, but in terms of how they live and how they engage with people, I think Jesus would walk away in shame. And so belief is a very nuanced thing, because I think someone can profess Jesus Lord without professing Jesus with their lips.
I very much agree with that. I'm also, as you would say as well, I'm sure, Justin, but I'm also conscious that there are some things that Christians have done, that the Christian church has done, that are enormously valuable and hugely compassionate. And there's been a great. I like to think that society is better because of the Christian conscience, because of the Puritan revival, because of the evangelicals of the 19th century. But the trouble is that some of the factory owners, I spoke about this last time, some of the factory owners who are employing children and people in horrendous conditions were singing hymns in church on Sunday. But there were others who were singing hymns in church on Sunday that were trying to make the factory owners behave differently. Yeah. Again, because of the same faith. It's a strange thing. It can push people in different ways, according to their outlook, according to their own needs, according to their own drives and ambitions.
Yeah. The same church, the same Bible that gives you Westboro Baptist Church is the same Bible that gives you Mother Teresa.
Yes. Oh, perfect. Yeah, that's a wonderful. Just explain Westboro Baptist Church, just in case people.
Actually, if you want a really good book to read, I forget who the author is. It's called Unfollow: My Journey from Westboro Baptist Church, and it's from Westboro Baptist Church is a church in America that was started by Phelps. I think his surname's Phelps, Reverend Phelps, and basically they would go and picket funerals and say that God hates fags, or they would go if a soldier died in war, they would go stand at the side and say, "This is God's justice." God is laughing, and the idea was not to bring people to repentance, but basically to tell people how bad they were.
Yeah, and to pick on they picked on certain categories, particularly they were just so ridiculous about homosexuality and same-sex relationships.
And if you go to if you look at Louis Theroux, is that his name?
Louis Theroux.
He's got a really interesting documentary. It's one of his first documentaries of Westboro Baptist, but really destructive and hurtful kind of rhetoric going out there. But it's interesting. The same faith that can give you that, the same they follow the same savior and can go totally different ways. And that's what I mean by the way. That's what I mean by this. Like, some people get the way, and other people, they're far from the way.
Well, the way of Jesus has to be involved with non-violence. It has to be involved with forgiveness. There has to be some element of suffering. If that is the way, then it's a pretty tough call. And it's not something which is individualistic. It's not something which is rooted in our own ego and our own fulfillment. It is connected to others and connected to bigger issues. So
Yeah, I think that this is my own thing. That if I ever met Jesus face to face, I probably would want to punch him, but yet follow him. I have the sense that he would.
Do you think he would punch you back?
Maybe not. but he probably, naughty boy. But
that's a quote from a film.
But it's more the fact that I think Jesus, we've domesticated Jesus, but the words Jesus spoke, I mean, to sell everything you have and follow him. I mean, if Jesus said that to me, I would be absolutely devastated. These moments where he gets upset with the disciples, and I think I am that disciple.
Oh, yeah.
Because I want those things, and I think there's part of me that Jesus really intrigues me, because what he says I know is life-giving, but at the same time, when I get down to like the ones and zeros of it, it's like, that is so hard.
And not just at an individual level, it's hard for our whole culture, because our whole culture is built on accumulating things on materialism and symbols of status and prosperity, and there's got to be a change in that, because it's destroying the planet.
Yeah, and even the idea of loving your enemy. I mean, I'm sometimes, if I was with Jesus, I'd be like, on your bike, son. And they're like, what are you speaking about? But we all know that
you need to lend him your bike for that exercise.
Yeah. I think he'd know how to ride one. I mean, he can walk on water, but can he ride a bike?
That's the title. That's the title of your first book, isn't it?
Yeah. Good. Let's get to the next question that someone asked, and this goes: does life repeat itself? If so, why? And how do we respond? All of this is asked in the context of moving through ages and stages, but also in the context of faith. So it's an interesting question, because the way I interpret the question is that this question of, is history circular or linear?
I'm glad you made that. I'm glad you made that clear.
Well, it's a squircle. There's, I think, the stories in the Bible, like the story of Exodus, is a story of people being in a circular understanding of history. You were born a slave, you were going to die a slave. Your oppression was going to be exactly the same. You were stuck in this loop, and it was just going to happen. Your descendants were the slaves, and then all of a sudden, God hears the cry of the oppressed, those caught in the loop, and sends Moses, and all of a sudden, they break free from this loop, and they're now moving into a new land, and it's so uncharted. It's all new. It's this linear, like, what is happening here? This is new. And through that journey, they start complaining, because they want to go back to Egypt, back to the circle, because if you're a slave, you know what's coming the next day. You know you've got a certain amount of bricks. You know X, Y, and Z. You know you're going to get this. And it's all about this linear. But if you read later on the stories, it goes back into the circular patterns again, and you need someone to break it out into and to move it forward. That's my.
Yeah. I remember as a student having a lecturer who talked about time. He was doing kind of anthropological kind of stuff with us, but based on studying different faiths, and he talked about lots of religions having a circular pattern. Just making sure you know what I mean here, whereas he said, whereas in biblical time is linear. So, and I was fascinated by that. I have to say, as I look at it again, I wonder if he's just. I'm now thinking he's overcooking it slightly, because there are a lot of circles in Scripture. I mean, it seems to me that the circles have maybe just got very much bigger. Mm-hmm. So, for example, you talk about slavery and Egypt and Pharaoh, but in Matthew's Gospel, you've got the beginning stories. You've got a Joseph who's having dreams. You've got a cruel king who's killing children. You've got the story repeated. Yeah. Now you've got a description of John the Baptist who wears camel hair coat and a leather belt, and he lives on locusts and honey. It's a clear description of Elijah. So it's come round again. Yeah. And there are lots of patterns where basically Scripture is actually saying, well, these things are repeating. Now, admittedly, that's presentational. I mean, that's their way they are saying it. But there is an element in which things do come round again. Yeah. And I guess the question is being asked maybe in terms of our own individual lives. And that can be quite scary. I mean, if, for example, addiction is a common problem. Lots of people have addictions. Some are visible, some are not, some remain hidden. Mm-hmm. But, somebody who grows up in a family with an addict is very likely to be the one who would suffer most and would want to avoid it most. But quite often, within a family, somebody who's the child of an addict will become an addict, will become themselves addicted to something. Yeah. And you think, how does that happen? Surely that's the very opposite of what you would expect. And there are family patterns that are astonishing, that in the way that you think, oh golly, this is so similar to my parents, my grandparents, or whatever. But I don't think it's ordained in any sense. I mean, I don't feel we're running on tram lines, railway lines that just govern our path through life. I think there may be a predisposition towards certain patterns of behaviour, and we need to identify that and be sure that we change them if we can, or if we feel we need to.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing because if you don't know what you're missing out on, it's difficult to change what you're missing out on. What your path. For example, if you've grown up and all you know is alcohol and this is life and this is the people get stuck in that, and it's a difficult thing to break out, because you need something else. What else is there? If this is all I've grown up with, and this is the only worldview I've been given, how do I break away from that worldview?
Yes. But yet there are certain human experiences that are bound to be similar. I mean, somebody, getting very old and frail and falling ill, will have the same needs, and perhaps will change in personality, and they will have the same influence and the same effect to those around them, whether that's in 1884 or 1984 or 2020. There will be common patterns, and so there are bound to be similarities within the main experiences of birth and love and death and disease and all of that. So there's bound to be some common things that we share going through the similar experiences.
Yeah, maybe that's why people find the Bible so inspiring, is that the stories of, as we were talking about Jesus, it's not just a story that happened, it happens. That these stories are not just stories that have been written, they're my stories too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't think we, as coming as to try and preach this storybook, I'm not interested in one man that was able to walk, or one man that got his sight back, or one man out of the whole of human race and human history, this extraordinary thing happened once. That strikes me as being interesting, maybe challenging, but not radical. It's not affecting anybody. The relevance and the truth of the biblical story is that they are replicated throughout life, throughout the ages, to every one of us. and that it's a universal truth that really matters. And even, dare I say it, maybe this is a bit challenging, but even the resurrection of Jesus, to me, the marvel in the story is not that one man, however you interpret it, I don't interpret that as a physical corpse coming back to life, but but even if that were the case, I don't see that as being all that remarkable or relevant. What is relevant is, can new life come about on a daily basis in the hearts and lives of individuals who know and believe in the love and the power of God in Jesus. And that seems to me to be powerful and relevant.
Yeah, and I would probably, if we're going to go on the resurrection thing, is resurrection offers us an opportunity to break the cycle of being stuck in the cycle. It says that death is not the final word, but life is. This moving out of it. There comes a point, I think, in life where if you realize that you are in a destructive pattern, it's no use going, oh, well, that's my parents. That's, there comes one point where you have to go, I'm putting a full stop down and I'm going to start a new sentence. And that sentence is not a sentence that starts with whatever came before, but I'm going to rise above it. Now, it doesn't mean I don't get trapped in the stuff of the past. It doesn't mean that what happened in the past didn't exist. It means that in spite of that, new life is being birthed. New life is coming forth, and I'm choosing to live, and I'm choosing in the sense of like a conscious effort not to be in the place of destruction and death that went before.
And that's a really, really hard challenge. I mean, I think it's, for some people, life is not fair. We all start from different places with different levels of advantage and disadvantage. There's no question. So we don't start with an equal playing field, with a level playing field. And for those who, for me, it's relatively easy not to become an alcoholic. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't mean that there's not the potential there, because I think there possibly is in lots of people. But for somebody who comes from a background in which there was addiction and alcohol, making the stand that you've just described is far more difficult. And I would be wanting to say to people, yes, make the effort, you can change. But I would also want to say, if you don't change, if you find you can't change, or at least in a temporary way you can't change, don't beat yourself up over that. Allow for the fact that actually you have a very hard challenge here, but keep trying.
Yeah. And I think it's our job as people who are trying to discover our role in faith is to be supportive rather than judgmental. Obviously there's certain boundaries you've got to put in place. If someone is an alcoholic or a drug user or abusive, there has to be a boundary somewhere.
What do you mean by a boundary, Justin?
Well, if someone is abusive, you don't have to allow them to be abusive to you.
No.
If someone is an alcoholic, for example, you don't have to allow that in your life in that sense. You can put a boundary, but a boundary of love, But what I'm getting at is that our job, I think, is to support people who are going through these transitions and to be their cheerleaders. And also to realize that some people might not want to change. We can't, it's a fine line, is to be a cheerleader, but also not someone who drags people through a process that they're not willing to go through. And that's a difficult thing, is to sort of know when to be one or the other. Is to let things go and walk away, but also to pick things up and cheer on.
We've used some of these things just as examples. They attempt to illustrate the point, but there's lots of things that are less obvious, but equally confining. People may feel a bit trapped in terms of the role they're playing suddenly, for example, caring for a very elderly relative. Yeah. It might be that happened in previous generations, or the daughter that stays at home to look, the unmarried daughter who stays at home to look after the aging mother, is the classic. And you think, well, if you then might have to settle to say, well, it's going to cause me less upset just to accept this, to suck it up and just make the best of it. Although inwardly you might be wanting to kick over all the traces and say, I need to get out, I need my freedom. Somebody else has to share the burden here. But the emotional cost of that might be deemed to be greater than it's worth. So people have to make some very difficult calculations. I would certainly want to say to people, well, make your decision, but then be easy with it. Accept yourself, accept the restrictions, and if it doesn't work out as you had hoped, well, try again, or just or accept it. It's about the acceptance thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think it's difficult when things are suck you in like that. I think, but it also you need to be able to speak it out and engage with it. It's again this thing of we started with questions, but there's nothing wrong with asking hard questions about the situation. Is it toxic? Do I need to be here? If it is something where you're going to suck it up, okay, then that's fine. But ask the questions about that. How do I make this more manageable? How do I have life? How do I end up that when this person dies, not living with resentment towards them? Yeah. Because the last thing you want is that person dies and you go, I actually hate them or I resent them because I spent 20 years looking after them and I gave them the best of my life and look what I have now.
Yeah, and that's very toxic.
Yeah, good. Well, Ken, we've been chatting for 40 minutes and it's been really engaging, and I want to thank you for being a great friend.
Well, Justin, thank you for asking me and for likewise being a great friend too. So it's great to have these chats with you.
Good. Courageous Conversations, we're going to take a month off, and so the second Wednesday in August, I'll just look on the date now. The second Wednesday in August is obviously it's not. Obviously, I'm going to get something that says it's the 12th. So we'll be back on the 12th of August. If people want to submit questions, just send them to my email, which is jtaylor@churchofscotland.org.uk, and we'll try to get a forum to discuss. Or if you have a topic that you think is really interesting and you want to engage with, just fire an email and we'll go from that. It's anonymous. Unless you really want your name mentioned, we'll put your name in. But we try to keep it anonymous.
That would be fine too if people are happy with that.
Yeah. Good. Well, Ken, thank you so much.
Okay.
And we'll see everybody back in just over a month. Keep safe.
Okay. Final question. Have you finished your whiskey?
Yes, I have. Good. And I'm going to go get some more.
I'm coming to your house next time.